What do you think, milady? Ludmilla looked up from her desk. Across from it stood Himsel, who was posing with his spear for some reason. What do I think of what, Himsel? The hair, milady. He turned to the side to reveal where he had tied his long, dark hair behind him. Looks like him, am I right? She suppressed a sigh. Maybe a bit. Despite her non-committal response, Himsel beamed and strode away with a spring in his step. Ludmilla looked back down at her desk, closing her eyes in a prayer of supplication. Lord Sursana, please forgive me for my imprudence. It was divine punishment. It had to be. She was feeling good about how things were going with her men and, despite her worries about making a mistake with one of them, she had gone and made a mistake with all of them. The thoughtless display of her blossoming iris had immediate and supremely awkward consequences. Sursana was a powerful god who could inflict all manner of ills upon the world and unleash his servants to visit countless evils upon its denizens. He did not, however, for he was a merciful god who overflowed with wisdom and temperance. As an adherent of Sursana, Ludmilla sought to emulate her god's measured and even-handed approach to all things. Straying from that path had invited divine wrath. Now, everyone thought that she was an obsessive Ludwig fan that only pretended to like Clarence. But she really did like Clarence, more than any other character in Dreams of Red. The more she insisted that it was the truth, however, the more the men smiled and nodded in their infuriatingly indulgent way. Not only that, but they consulted her as the #1 Ludwig fan. Anything to do with Ludwig was a topic for conversation and she was obliged to entertain them for at least the bare minimum of polite conduct. She glowered at the receding figure of Himsel as he strolled back out between the tents, eyeing the ponytail streaming behind him. Then she reached behind herself to untie her own. Did they see that as a sign of her fanaticism, as well? Ludmilla sighed as she combed out the waves of her long hair. She was ruined. Any respect she had earned as an officer had vanished like ashes in the winter wind. She was supposed to be cool, calm and professional, just like Ludv. Arg. Curse you, Florine. Why did she have to base Ludwig on her? It was especially strange considering she had come up with the character concept over a year before the annexation of Erantel. How long had Florine been watching her for? For all of her excellent and goodly qualities, Florine was just as sneaky as every other civilian noble. The dreamer had even gone and named all of her martial arts once she found out about them. Ludmilla liked those names, believing them both poetic and well-suited for each. Blossoming Iris, for instance, brought to mind the 3 petals of an iris flower as it bloomed, representative of the 3 vectors of the advanced strike art and the force of its effect. Upon discovering how wildly popular Dreams of Red was in the Empire, however, she couldn't bring herself to refer to them by the names that had become associated with Ludwig. If she did, Ludmilla feared that she would be seen as an imposter. An imposter of her imposter. After settling her feelings of frustration and embarrassment, she read through the incomplete entry of her report. Following a basic martial assessment of her men, she wanted to use the time off duty to see what common folk in the 6th Legion aspired to. As General Ray had pointed out, they were probably not in the army purely out of some selfless sense of tradition or service. She didn't know how they planned to pursue their aspirations, however. It wasn't so much the fact that she couldn't understand how it worked but how they could manage what that sort of life entailed. A noble and their tenants lived on their land. One could work in a field or a forest or a mine, but, at the end of the day, they came home to their families. Urban tenants were similar, one went to work and one came home from work. Master artisans often had living space incorporated into their workshops. The closest thing she could equate to the life of an imperial knight was that of a merchant. Both might stay away from home for months and even years at a time, but how a common soldier managed familial responsibilities was a mystery. Merchants, at least, made some sense. They usually had homes in urban areas where their guilds or at least a temple school provided education for their children. Once children reached a certain age, they could apprentice with their parents or a local merchant from their home guild. Imperial knights, however, did not have access to the same support network. While noble scions had manors and households that saw to their domestic affairs, common soldiers did not. On paper, it seemed straightforward. Regular soldiers who distinguished themselves would receive an honorary knighthood. Presumably, those who reached this point would earn income enough to support a family, but the Empire did not have a system of squires for the Imperial Knights as Paladin orders had. It was a vaguely horrifying thing to her, The child of a tailor started a basic familiarization of their parents' trade around the age of 6, preparing them for an eventual apprenticeship. The child of a commoner imperial knight, however, was counted as fortunate if there was a temple school in the area that taught them how to read. While other children prepared for their future vocations, the child at best would take after the parent who stayed at home. At worst. Ludmilla looked to her left where Joachim Ward was standing by. He wasn't exactly a commoner, but he was a spare who would be in the same situation. "Priest Ward," she asked, "are you married?" Her attendant visibly froze at the question. Was it something so strange to ask? He was slightly older than she, meaning that, as a follower of the Four, he had at least half a decade so far to find a partner and start a family. Then again, followers of the Four were generally strange. They upheld chastity as a virtue, nonsensically equating refusal to continue their bloodlines to purity. At the same time, they allowed rampant polygamy and didn't keep track of anything, scrambling any sense of one's vocational lineage and potentially undoing centuries of breeding that cultivated vocational aptitudes. As a cleric of the Four, Joachim might not even be expected to wed. There were atrocious rumors revolving around vows of celibacy and ascetics who secluded themselves from healthy human lives. Little about their heretical ways made sense. It was as if they wanted to go extinct like some sort of slow-motion suicide cult. Joachim's grey eyes remained fixed on the campfire for a good minute before responding. "I'm not, my lady. Why do you ask?" "I know how things work in the Imperial Army from an official perspective," she replied, "but I know little of the soldiers' personal affairs. They live lives on the field or in the garrisons they've been assigned to, so family life or business seem like impossible things to manage." The cleric of the Earth God seemed to relax. What had he thought she was asking? "That's what you mean. I suppose it's not something that someone from Riestais would be familiar with. Normally, since most of the men don't have chains to tie them down, they get together with women in the places where they're assigned. Since a regular army group has a set jurisdiction, they're always a week or two away from their families at most." "Where do their families live?" "Unless they've been knighted and earn substantial honors, they won't have any land before retirement." An Imperial Knight's family usually resides in a town or city. Most of them are spares who came from the same general situation, after all. Since spares usually have a hard life of low-wage labor awaiting them, the salaries offered by the army are very attractive. I know it sounds terrible, but soldiers are, in turn, attractive to women in towns and cities because they earn more. More terrible than you know. Since the Sorcerer King desired that his grace be extended over all peoples, regardless of race or culture, Ludmilla didn't have any issues with sharing the fundamental truths of the world with the Empire. The problem was that the Empire bore little interest in the truth, preferring to fabricate its own based on the illusion of strength and control it had woven around itself. However, she was simply a liaison officer acting as a point of communication and understanding between the Sorceress Kingdom's government, the Death Series servitors and the Imperial Army. Broaching this topic with the cleric of the Four was likely a waste of energy and matters that require time to demonstrably prove could be proven at home. She rose from her seat and stepped out from behind her desk, walking down the aisle created by her squad's tents. Many were sleeping or at least trying to rest and relax inside them, but there were a handful lounging about outside. Frank and Igval straightened and turned to regard her as she approached them. "At ease, gentlemen," Ludmilla said. "You seemed engrossed in your discussion." "Just talking about what you were talking about, milady," Igval said. "The drills you put us through were really different from the army's training. Made us think a lot about what we should learn next. I thought it might be useful based on how General Ray has been conducting these sweeps through the wilderness," she replied. "What he is employing essentially adapts the Imperial Army's operations within its borders. This will be fine for now, but the current methods will see a marked reduction in effectiveness by the end of the week." "You figured that out after following the companies around for one day?" As an outsider, she told them, "Some things are easier to notice. Especially when my background is so different from the Imperial Army's. It's still a presumption of mine, however. Maybe General Ray has something else prepared. Anyhow, I had some questions for the two of you if you don't mind." Frank and Igval exchanged looks. "Sure," Frank said. "As long as it's something we can answer." "How did you join the Imperial Army?" Ludmilla asked. "What were you doing before that?" The two warriors seemed taken aback at her question, but the reply was immediate. "I'm from a mining town," Frank said. "A bit bigger than Orenstead here. Army recruiters look for big, strong men, so they always come around where you can find them. Mines, quarries, warehouse districts, places where there's heavy labor. Life in the army's way better than all that back-breaking work, and the pay's better too, so they don't have no problems snapping people up." "Did you do any work before that? Were your parents miners?" "Yeah, they were," the man nodded. "I worked in the mines starting from round 8. Got into the dangerous, heavy stuff once I grew up enough. I got a few years taste in that and went straight to the recruiters that came round last winter. I was good and strong by that time, so they took me right away." Ludmilla winced internally. People could build muscle, condition their bodies and gain job class levels in vocations that were physically demanding, but it was no substitute for having job class levels in a vocation appropriate for the task at hand. Frank was born in a mining town to a mining family and worked in the mines for a few years. If he was lucky, he would only have one job class level in miner, but it would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Imperial recruitment officers gauged men and women based on their outward physical appearance if they were considering them as potential warriors. Frank's work in the mines allowed him to develop a robust physique that impressed the officers enough that they accepted him immediately. It was a critical flaw in a process that was supposed to produce the best of the best. The Empire's meritocratic ideals led to the belief that their institutions could take what they erroneously identified as raw material and refine it to suit their requirements. 1 or 2 levels in miner could not be compared to the same number of levels in a warrior-type job class, nor did it account for physical and vocational aptitudes passed down through one's lineage. If the recruitment officers had put Ludmilla and Frank side by side at the same time the previous year, a visual assessment would have resulted in Frank being chosen. In reality, Ludmilla would have been capable of one-sidedly thrashing him due to their different job class levels. Fortunately for Frank, he had only worked as a miner for a few years. She didn't know if it meant that he had 1 level or 5 levels in miner, but if his limit in levels was average, he could still become the equivalent of a silver rank adventurer in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. This put him in line with the Empire's veteran Imperial Knights and the weaker members of the Royal Earth Guard, so Ludmilla sadly wondered how many soldiers in the Imperial Army were inflicted with a similar type of build contamination. "What about you, Igval?" "I was a town brat, milady," the other warrior said. "Born to laborers doing odd jobs in a place not far from Horst. I helped 'em carry stuff around. My parents were spares from the country, so you could say that I'm the spare of a spare." "Where did your parents come from?" My pa was from a farm nearby. Ma was an orphan that the temple took in. She wasn't able to learn magic, so she just became spare hands like my pa. Only thing I got from him was this big body, so I used it to join the army like Frank here during the summer." In terms of his job class levels, Igval was probably in a far better situation than Frank. Performing mundane chores and basic tasks was something that everyone did, and the tenets of her faith only warned against excessive work along those lines. If he focused on his profession as a soldier, he had the potential to become the equivalent of a platinum rank adventurer with a pure job class build. It was such a simple thing to become far stronger than the average army veteran, but Imperial culture made it difficult. "You've both progressed into silver rank if we use adventurer standards in the Empire," Ludmilla said, "so it feels that advancement in the army should follow. What do you hope to gain from your service?" Frank and Igval visibly brightened at the idea that they might be due for some sort of recognition. "We learn our spurs first, of course," Frank said. "After that, a few of us are trying to pool enough money to start some sort of business in the conquered lands." "About half of us say hauling's good," Igval added. "They'll need to move all sorts of things to the south from the Wyvern Mark. We can take our earnings and keep buying wagons and get the whole thing rolling while we campaign around." While she wasn't an expert on such ventures, it felt prudent enough. By investing their capital in businesses that they were not directly involved in, they wouldn't risk hampering their own development and allow others to focus on their own. Still, what about equipment? She asked. The 6th Legion still uses arms and armor standard to the Imperial Army. If one's achievements lead to recognition, shouldn't you invest your earnings in magical items so you can earn greater achievements? "Some of the men want to do that," Igval said, "but magic items are expensive. How much was that sword we saw in Castleheim, again?" "Too much," Frank chuckled. They said it was just a regular magic sword, but it cost 5 years' salary for an Imperial Knight. General Ray goes on about all the gains we'll be making, but unless we kill a dragon or something, there's no way the split'll be big enough. Better to have something that steadily builds up. Having been subjected to all sorts of things that had killed her through mundane equipment, Ludmilla couldn't say that she agreed. At the same time, it didn't seem that they had any way to afford it unless they received recognition for something exceptional. All they had to rely on was basic equipment, their skills and their comrades. To be honest, it wasn't bad. It was simply reality for the vast majority of people. As they would live respectable lives as Imperial Knights. Given what they were going to face as an expeditionary force, many men in the 6th Legion would die, but they had effectively become soldiers of fortune exclusively contracted by the Baharuth Empire. With that career came the risks that they had broadly volunteered for. Then what about family life? Ludmilla asked. A posting in the 6th Legion will be very different from the other army groups. You have a long career ahead of you, and this expeditionary army will be busy expanding the borders of the Empire for decades. I barely gave a thought to it since we started training, Frank said. Even less now that the generals got us running all over the place. It'd be nice, but you're right, if we're never home, it won't be much of a family life. That's true, Igval nodded. Still, I bet plenty of girls won't mind as long as we keep bringing back our pay. They probably wouldn't even have to work. Life in the army's tough, but, at the same time, I feel more alive than I've ever been. I'd rather be here than at home. It seemed that reactions to the 6th Legion's reality were mixed, though she should have expected it. As a noble, her thoughts continually turned to her domain, but communication in the Sorceress Kingdom was far superior to that of the Empire. The elder lichers at home could always message her if they needed her input on administrative affairs, and proposals that she needed to read over could be delivered through a variety of means. Teleportation was available if her presence was required anywhere. The same could not be said for nobles in the 6th Legion, so it would likely be populated by spares or those committed to a military career. General Ray's battalion presented one extreme where traditional influences were minimized and a culture that was more common-centric became prevalent. Ludmilla wasn't sure if this, too, was part of Prime Minister Albedo's experiment, but she wouldn't be surprised if it was. By the way, she turned her attention to Joachim Ward. I don't think I asked you just now, Priest Ward. How does compensation in the Imperial Army work for its clergy? Our terms are negotiated by the temples, my lady, he replied. Priests can be knighted, but we are never enfeoffed as a matter of imperial law. Other honors are usually donated to our home temples. The cleric's response was appropriately priestly, though, with the imperial administration's general stance towards the temples, they can't have been happy that anything at all was going to the temples of the Four. How the temples might be incorporated into the royal army of the Sorceress Kingdom to serve their living members was still a matter under consideration, but Ludmilla couldn't imagine that it would be an antagonistic relationship like the Empire had with the temples of the Four. While the temples of the Four in the Sorceress Kingdom would vehemently refuse the very idea of working with the undead, the temples of the Six would probably leap at the chance to provide clerics and paladins when they finally had some to spare. Many tribal groups also had no qualms serving the Sorcerer King and, like the temples of the Six, groups like the Frost Giants would insist on joining. In fact, dozens of them already had. That seems straightforward enough, Ludmilla said. Thank you for answering my questions, Frank, Igval. Please enjoy the rest of your day. So, Ray said, she conducted some exercises with the men. Yes, sir, Captain Hawk replied. They weren't anything like the usual drills we do, though. What is she playing at? The wind flicked at the fringes of Ray's pavilion as he listened to the captain's report. Upon returning from the second sweep out of his first outpost, Ray found nothing amiss in the camp. Though he would have liked to, he had little time to catch up with Baroness Aradnik's daily antics. They were due to depart for the next outpost site early the following morning, and he had a dozen things to go over before turning in. His battalion's advance up the valley required his complete attention. Now, finally settled in on the evening of his fourth day in the wilderness, Ray could finally spend some time figuring out what was going on with the Baroness while he waited for more detailed reconnaissance reports of the area. The new outpost was being raised on one side of the increasingly wooded valley, where the river carved a tall cliff out of the range to the east. The sun had already sunk below the range to the west, but the cliffs above still caught its light, bathing their position in its orange glow. What was the objective of these exercises? Ray asked. Learning to fight as a squad, I guess? Captain Hawk answered, all on foot. Gave us a few things to think about, but everything we did'll take a lot of training to come together. Well, she did watch the 2nd Legion at work in the blister, Ray said. Was what she was doing something she observed from Carbane's men? No, sir. She had us show her what we could do, pointed out some things from the manual and had us play a game that she played as a girl. Ray sincerely hoped that she wasn't doing anything to undermine the 6th Legion's basic training. The last thing he needed was an excitable girl who believed that she knew better than experienced fighting men and their officers. At least it appeared that her influence was limited to the bodyguard he had left her to play with. What else did she do? Seems like she was spending time getting to know her men better. Aside from that, she let them rest. Did she say anything at all about our battalion or its officers? Something about the way we're clearing out this valley not working so well soon. Looks like she was right, things keep getting tighter and it's getting hard to work with our horses. We're gonna need to start fighting on foot to reach some of these tribes soon. The preliminary reconnaissance flights suggested as much, and it was somewhat common knowledge that the wilderness grew less sparse the deeper south one went. He did recognize that Lady Zaradnik had a certain degree of competence as a commander, but it didn't take much to guess that cavalry wouldn't be as effective as before. Progress would be slower due to the vegetation and more enemies would be present, but Ray was confident that they would still be able to press forward with few issues. Was there anything else? Captain Hawk stared blankly at the pavilion wall for a moment. While he was bestowed an honorary knighthood, the man was born a regular commoner and thus couldn't be expected to present himself as smoothly as someone with an aristocratic or mercantile background. On the field, this didn't mean much, but it had the effect of making the sort of analysis Ray wanted of the Baroness difficult. She's like one of them noble captains you see around the army, sir. Oh, she's a Ludwig fan. Ray couldn't help but furrow his brow. I beg your pardon? Ludwig, the Baron from Dreams of Red, sir. I see. Thank you, Captain. Captain Hawk saluted before turning on his heel and leaving the pavilion. Ray watched his departure with a silent shake of his head. What did the fact that Baroness Zaradnik was a Ludwig fan have to do with anything? Granted, many idolized the larger-than-life characters of the popular story, but surely she couldn't be so swept up in martial fantasies that she expected to imitate purely fictional feats. Surely not. After an uneventful briefing the next morning, Lady Zaradnik and her bodyguard or squad or whatever she saw it as joined Ray on their sweep of the surroundings. With the portion of the valley accessible by cavalry much reduced, they would only need a day to break up the tribes in their path. They started by following the river north, going through the areas cleared by their passage to the new outpost. The brush along the valley bottom, while still relatively sparse, formed large stands that demanded caution as his companies divided themselves to ride around them. The men still seem confident in these surroundings, Lady Zaradnik noted. How long will it be until you expect substantial resistance, Your Excellency? Was she growing more nervous the further they went from civilization? He still couldn't get a read on her. If there was one thing the young noblewoman excelled at, it was maintaining her aristocratic mask. Her incomprehensible activities offered no insight as to her objectives, but those, too, may have been part of the tactics she was employing to foil others' attempts at discerning her motives. With a force like this, my lady, Ray conveyed his assessment in a confident tone, I don't think it's reasonable to expect anything today. Aerial reconnaissance hasn't noted any settlements of particular note. The demi-humans here seem no better prepared to resist us than those around the previous outpost. It was a vaguely disappointing outcome, as far as he was concerned. The sooner he could bring substantial retaliation to bear upon the Imperial border, the sooner use of the Death Series servitors held hostage by the 5th Legion could be justified. How do your operations compare with those conducted in the Katsa marches? The southeastern corner of the 8th Legion's former jurisdiction lies right over these mountains to the west, Ray replied. The areas bordering the Katsa plains are a wind-swept grassland, but as you approach the foothills the terrain becomes similar to this. We occasionally conducted operations to push back tribal groups settling too close to our borders, so I have a realistic set of expectations for what we're doing here. Given your experience, I'm surprised that you didn't choose the familiar side of the mountains for your advance. To be frank, my lady, it's not terribly exciting. The fort at the southernmost extent of the Imperial border along the Katza Plains is about as far south as we are right now. South of that is the slice of land leading down between the eastern edge of the Katza Plains and these mountains here, which will eventually have my battalion and the two divisions on the other side meet in a wide mountain pass. So you chose this valley as it better suits your ambitions within the means available to your battalion. A rousing battle cry rose several hundred meters to their southwest as the 8th Company clashed with a tribe of demi-humans marked out on their maps the previous day. Their discussion paused as they listened to the waxing and waning of combat. Co 10, report. Business as usual, sir. A few bumps and scrapes. Our clerics will have recovered their mana by the time we get to the next objective. Excellent. Make sure the survivors are driven west or south. We don't want them going back into territory we've already cleared. Ray turned his attention back to Lady Zaradnik, who was patiently awaiting his response. Yes, my lady. Opportunities are to be seized, after all. Do you perhaps oppose such views? On the contrary, the Baroness replied, I find that those who earnestly pursue their ambitions possess an undeniable appeal. As much as people like to share their aspirations with others, not all possess the courage to take decisive steps towards their objectives, and few are able to see their actions through to the end when challenges arise. Being able to achieve one's goals in realistic and productive ways is a valuable skill. If you like ambitious men so much, shouldn't you be a Clarence fan? Ludwig was possessed of fantastic degrees of martial valor that many readers found exciting. He was also a perfect officer if one were to put it nicely. If one was blunt about it, however, he was the ideal tool who carried out the will of his superiors with unsettling single-mindedness. Clarence, on the other hand, was a highly charismatic socio-political phenom whose mastery of domestic and foreign affairs firmly placed him at the top of the Great Hegemony's list of rising stars. In Ray's mind, at any rate, Clarence's machinations were incalculably more effective and far-reaching than Ludwig's localized influence as a captain. The only characteristics that the two characters had in common were their piety and sense of order. Ray directed his formations along their predetermined routes through the wilderness, his mobile headquarters shadowing their advance. The clamor of another battle rose to their west, and he stopped on a rise to see if he could gain a vantage on his company's positions. Roughly 5 kilometers distant, the foot of the mountains were shrouded in what could be called a proper forest, but he didn't plan on pushing into it. I spoke with many of the men in the past few days, Your Excellency, Lady Zaradnik said as Ray scanned the surroundings. They all seem to follow you in pursuit of their own ambitions. Being a general isn't just about the ability to strategize and command, my lady, Ray replied. Understanding what motivates your men is just as important, if not more. Is that why you handpicked these companies for your battalion? Indeed, he nodded. Not all commands are cast from the same mold. Even in the 6th Legion, many of the companies have a more traditional outlook. Defensive mindsets, ideas of what attracts men into service, old values from the martial aristocracy. This outlook is appropriate for the regular army groups stationed within the Empire's borders, but entirely unsuited for an expeditionary force. I would even go so far as to say that the traditional attitudes of the Imperial Army are out of alignment with the vast majority of its citizens. They resumed their advance along its southwestern course. A few minutes later, the 9th Company came in to pick up new lances, ammunition and other supplies from the mobile headquarters supply train. Ray nodded in satisfaction at the brisk, professional atmosphere that the men had cultivated in their operations since their first tentative sorties from the Imperial border. Lady Zaradnik watched them intently as well, but whether she appreciated the same things as he did was uncertain. The clash of values in an army can have severe, detrimental effects, Ray told her. Differences in individual direction, managing internal politics, lack of a unified vision, the slightest trace has the effect of stealing momentum and sapping energy from the whole. If taken to its extremes, mutiny and infighting will occur, but there doesn't need to be a substantial amount to leave an army operating at a fraction of its potential effectiveness. In this battalion, every officer understands the broad strategy being employed, our objectives and what purpose they serve. Every man understands that, by carrying out their orders, they also serve their own interests. This unity of purpose allows us to achieve exponentially more than would otherwise be possible. So you don't believe that the other elements of the 6th Legion will be able to obtain this same level of performance? Ray snorted as he imagined all of the commanders and their officers attempting to wrangle thousands of ambitious men who only paid lip service to the Imperial Army's decidedly unambitious traditions. It would be difficult, my lady, he told her. The vast majority of the men in the 6th Legion have served for less than 3 years. At least a third have less than a year of service. General Gregan, his commanders and many of the captains, however, have served for far longer. Passing down generations of martial tradition has always been the Imperial Army's way, but, as I mentioned, that tradition is both defensive and rooted in aristocratic values that would be considered a luxury to the common man. It is the exact opposite of what recruits expect for the 6th Legion. Must it be one thing or the other, Your Excellency? Lady Zaradnik asked. The current system of honors in the Empire holds the distribution of titles at its pinnacle. This would naturally have the effect of scaling back the ambition of exceptional Imperial Knights once it is achieved. This concern is addressed by the realities of territorial expansion into the wilderness, Ray answered. Even if an Imperial Knight is in fiefs, they'll still need resources to develop their fiefs. The men will be driven to achieve gains in the name of the Empire, and the Court Council will more than happily part with monetary awards instead of land. Rather than scaling back the ambitions of the men, this sort of expansion serves to fuel it because of the overabundance of land and the need to develop it. What of exceptional Imperial Knights? You'll eventually have those rising through the ranks that may be the equivalent of powerful adventurers. If only it was so easy. The Baroness' question spoke of her inexperience, or perhaps because the Sorceress Kingdom was filled to the brim with powerful beings. Exceptional individuals were exceptional precisely because they were of exceptionally rare quality. Those who did appear rarely joined any imperial institutions. Even the great Imperial Knights and the captain of the Imperial Guard were at best somewhere around Mithril or Orichalcum in personal strength. There were far more people at that level of strength or higher who did not serve the Empire, instead becoming workers, adventurers, gladiators, or pursuing some other independent avenue. Nothing the Emperor was willing to do could tempt them into his service, and he dared not court their wrath by forcing the issue. The strong dictated terms to the weak. Empires were no exception to this rule. Not that the Empire would need them anymore. The power of the Sorceress Kingdom's Death Series servitors stood beyond the strength of mortal men, and they were leased out at an unreasonably cheap price when one considered that a single one of them could probably match the entire Imperial Army under the right circumstances. Individuals of that caliber rarely join the Imperial Army, Ray said. Those who do eventually become great Imperial Knights or occupy other positions of honor. What of you, my lady? Given your assignment, I assume that you have at least some experience in commanding the undead? Enough that I am confident enough to assist with their integration into the Imperial Army, Lady Zaradnik replied. My experience as a commander is limited, however. I am from a martial house and was raised under my family's traditions, but I only inherited my position after the Battle of Katza Plains last year. It was all Ray could do not to laugh in helpless frustration as they rode along. Being lucky was often said to greatly influence one's destiny, but Baroness Zaradnik was absurdly so. A whim of fate had thrust a young woman into a position of power that generals with long careers filled with great achievements and hard-earned experience could only dream of. This fact was both enviable and troubling for Ray. His objective was to impress Lady Zaradnik, but Lady Zaradnik's experience consisted of commanding forces that could end entire nations with little issue. Success for her was as simple as pointing a finger and watching her unshakable, absolutely loyal undead soldiers devastate everything in their path. The Baroness' perspective was something he had considered, however. Given her roots as a noble of Riestais, her probable inexperience and the youthful frivolity in her actions, Ray expected that he would be able to appeal to her as a capable commander. He had prepared men who would follow his orders as best as they could, and her opinions would hinge on how her perception was accordingly framed. They ain't here, sir. Ray furrowed his brow at the unexpected report from the 8th Company's captain. What do you mean by not here? As in up and left, sir. Clearing's here. So's the mess. Tribe isn't. The tribe in question wasn't large, roughly 100 individuals by the estimates of their aerial reconnaissance. In theory, small tribes were more likely to flee than large ones. Did that mean he was finally creating the right tribal movements, or was it something else? Ray scanned the horizon, wishing that he had a hippogriff of his own to see what was going on. I'll have the dragoons look into it. Keep going. But stay sharp for signs as to what happened to those demi-humans. Yes, sir." Unable to spot their attendant service flight, Ray turned to one of the mages in his bodyguard. "Tota, get me Captain Yovel." "On it, sir." Ray sighed, mulling over the possibilities. It could have been a coincidental migration, for all he knew. With the coming of spring, any number of tribes could be moving from their winter settlements. "I have Captain Yovel, sir. Tell him that Group F6 is missing. We need to figure out where they went. He's looking into it now." After one last glance around, Ray instructed his mobile headquarters to head over to the abandoned demi-human camp. While he understood that information could never be perfect, he never liked not knowing exactly what was going on around him. They arrived at the camp, where he instructed his men to spread out and investigate the surroundings. The reek of goblin was still fresh on the piles of refuse strewn between the crude shelters left behind to be claimed by the elements. Their advance had brought them high enough up the valley that late snows still lay in the shadows, filling hollows and dips in the ground. All of the groups in today's sweep were confirmed as of yesterday, yes? "Yes, my lady," Ray replied. "They can't have gotten far, but small deviations in our plans affect everything down the line. There were no indications that they were getting ready to move. Then again, these tribes don't have many belongings to carry with them in the first place." "It isn't officially spring yet," Lady Zaradnik noted, "but spring has certainly come to this valley. I didn't see anything on your maps indicating animal movement or potential dens from where hibernating creatures might emerge." As if on cue, a screech pierced the air, settling into a rumbling growl. Several screams rose from an outcropping on the east side of their camp. "There are more girls in your battalion than I thought," the Baroness said lightly. The sound of boots hitting the dirt sounded around them as Lady Zaradnik's bodyguard dismounted. Another monstrous shriek growl filled the air as she dismounted as well. Ray edged his warhorse away from the sound. "Why are you dismounting, my lady?" he asked. "They aren't something you want to be fighting from horseback," she answered. With that, she walked off to an open part of the demi-human camp with her men. They started to spread out as she pointed to various positions in front of her. "Orders, sir?" Ray eyed the men of his bodyguard, who kept glancing back and forth between him and Lady Zaradnik. Was she purposely trying to upstage him? The Baroness had swiftly seized upon an unexpected situation, stealing the initiative from him with a calm performance that was sure to win the confidence of all who witnessed her. That was if the outcome did not prove her a fool. At the same time, that outcome would reflect badly on him, and any injury to her person would surely come with a requisite cost. It was a move that cost her little unless it killed her outright. Politically, any lesser costs would be shouldered by Ray as the commander of the battalion. As much as he was irked by the fact that she had deftly outmaneuvered him, that same maneuver demanded respect. It was also far more aggressive than a noblewoman's typical behavior, and he would have to recalculate his tactics when it came to her. "Have you fought these before, Sergeant?" "Owlbears? Yeah, real nasty beasties." Ray nodded at the sergeant's reply. As someone who focused on his vocation as a commander, Ray's exposure to direct combat was minimal. He had gone from the Imperial Magic Academy to the Imperial Military Academy and entered the Imperial Army on the back of his promising performance as a student of strategy. Needless to say, this focus on command meant that he was either behind a desk or behind an army, and his experience with the patrols that encountered wilderness threats was minimal. That he had little in the way of martial valor was not a point of shame for Ray. He positioned himself in the place where he would be the most effective, and that was that. Now that he knew what they were up against, he could refer to what he had learned from his studies and reviewed in reports. An owlbear was a magical beast, and adults were at minimum a difficulty rating 36 target by the measures of the region's adventurer guilds. This meant that a commission involving an owlbear was considered one that required a gold-rank adventurer team to tackle with reasonable expectations for success. The piercing roar of the owlbear filled the air again as 3 of his men scurried out from behind the outcropping. Gold-rank adventurers couldn't survive in the Empire because the Imperial Army did their work. Ray's bodyguard was a squad of men who could each match veteran Imperial knights in strength, so dispatching an owlbear would be a simple matter of execution. "Get your men ready, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." "Should we dismount?" "Do it. Bonded mounts might be able to survive, but the regular ones won't." As his men scurried in to rejoin their squad, Ray's eyes widened as not 1, but 4 owlbears came into view. They immediately charged, red-rimmed eyes issuing frenzied glares over wickedly sharp beaks. Scraps of refuse and broken tents went into the air as the magical beasts barreled straight towards them. Were they all adults? They had to be. Each was larger than his warhorse and had a body like that of a large bear with its front half covered in striped and spotted feathers. One was half again as large as the others. Was it a male, or was it some strong variant? All four were charging straight after the men that had come to the squad, at least until several arrows and bolts came from the side to strike the largest and the one closest to it. They slowed their charge and reared onto their hind legs, turning to regard Lady Zaradnik's bodyguard with crazed looks on their owl-like faces. The taller of the two was 4 meters in height, but Ray couldn't spare any further attention as the remaining pair closed within a meter of the line of men ahead of him. "Brace!" the sergeant called out. "Fortress! Fortress!" A few more calls of the defensive art went up as the magical beast slammed into the rank of men. The air seemed to shudder from the impact and the line held, yet the massive forms pressing the soldiers made losses seem inevitable. "Bennett," Ray called out, "do you have a way to disable one of them?" The cleric of the Earth God raised his holy symbol high. "Sunlight." Ray shielded his eyes as a flash of intense light flared over the shoulders of his men. The ear-piercing cries of the owlbears sounded in response. He winced at how loud they were from several meters away. The blinding spell didn't give them a moment's pause. In fact, the owlbears seemed to grow all the more enraged. Paws as wide as a man's chest ripped across the rank with knife-like claws that looked as long as his forearm. Spears from men who weren't desperately trying to defend themselves jabbed in. "Bennett, did that work? One of them is blind, but I sure can't tell the difference." The cleric drew his mace, pointing it over the heads of the struggling men. "My lord, O God of Earth, bestow your divine providence upon the battlefield." Prayer. A surge of divine favor filled him as Bennett's spell burst forth over the surroundings. The men's attacks became sharper, their opponents, less so. "My lord, O God of Earth, may courage guide the strong arm of your devoted warriors. Bless." Even with divine magic fortifying his men, the owlbears still appeared a dire threat. They were a mass of feathers, claws and unbridled rage, seemingly lashing out at random. The men struggled to defend themselves against sudden attacks that tore gashes in steel breastplates forged by the Empire's finest armorsmiths. Ray examined each, trying to determine which one had been blinded. "Focus on the right. It isn't blind. Sergeant, help handle the other one." The men shifted according to Ray's instructions, pressing in with their spears to topple one of their towering foes. A loud clank, followed by the screech of claws on metal, sounded from the side. "Milady, this thing's damn angry." "That's fine, they're always angry." Tempted as he was to see what was going on, Ray continued to focus on his end. The owlbear on the right was soaked in blood from dozens of deep wounds, yet still flailed about with no less energy than before. Its thrashing caused a scorching ray spell to miss. Tota cursed and switched to the more reliable magic arrow. 3 of the men were on the ground and Bennett was tending to one of them. In seconds that seemed like minutes, their first enemy succumbed to its wounds and collapsed. The men were visibly exhausted, but they were only half done. "Good job. Don't let up yet, there's one mo. Fuck. Let go of me, you." Ray turned his head just in time to see the sergeant lifted in a brutal bear hug. Oblivious to the spears jabbing into it, the second owlbear brought its head down and crushed the man's full helm in its beak. As if squeezing an overripe fruit, streams of blood spilt out from under the helmet and over the man's plate armor. The soldiers faltered at the grisly death of their officer and, as if it wasn't enough, the owlbear twisted its neck and ripped the sergeant's head off before dropping back down to all fours. It immediately turned to send a savage swipe at another man nearby. He went flying into one of the crude tents left behind by the demi-human tribe. Cries of panic rose from the men as the hulking magical beast hurtled forward in another devastating charge. "Over here, you crazy so." A soldier with a shield nearby received the owlbear's charge with Fortress. An arrow sprouted from the magical beast's flank and more soldiers came from behind the brave infantrymen to surround their foe. Ray relaxed as the remaining owlbear was put down with no further fatalities, letting out a breath as his gaze crossed over the camp. It was then that he realized that the fighting was over and all 4 owlbears had been slain. The soldier that had received the final charge of the second owlbear had been one of the men from the Baroness' bodyguard. Roughly 50 meters to the right, the largest owlbear lay in a bloody heap, The second one was lying against the base of a tree, its head and shoulders feathered with arrows. A ranger was perched on a branch overhead, looking down tentatively as if unsure whether the thing was dead or not. "Your Excellency." Baroness Zaradnik approached from the direction of her men, though Ray hadn't noticed her with them as he scanned the aftermath. Her exquisitely crafted equestrian uniform remained spotless and she seemed entirely unfazed from witnessing the bloody battle. "My lady," Ray nodded. "Are you all right?" "Yes, thank you," she replied. "How will you be proceeding?" Ray took inventory of the situation. His men nearby were lying down or otherwise trying to catch their breath while Bennett went around tending to the long backlog of wounds that had accumulated during the fight. Lady Zaradnik's bodyguard had returned to gather around the large owlbear, chatting excitedly between themselves. One of the men was showing off a tower shield furrowed with claw marks. The ranger in the tree dropped down to join them. "What's with this difference? Did you know the sergeant well?" The question drew him from his frustrated thoughts. "Not personally," he replied, "but he was a man with a good record. Since he was close to making captain, I had him lead my bodyguard under the notion that being exposed to greater responsibility would be good for him." It went without saying that the promotion to captain while serving Ray directly would encourage the man to be personally loyal to him. Every soldier in his bodyguard was handpicked for similar reasons. They were all capable, yet still unrecognized and would see Ray as their benefactor when they were finally knighted or received other honors. While not precisely a debacle, in fact, the battle only having a single fatality was exceptional considering their opponents, Ray saw it as a stain on his reputation. Direct service to General Ray needed to be seen as a sure route to honor and glory, not an early grave. While his entire battalion could be said to be built on that principle, losses were to be expected and the idea that one could die would always be someone else in his forces. "That's a shame," Lady Zaradnik said. "Captains are the linchpin of the Imperial Army, the death of one is a major loss." "Why captains in particular, my lady?" "It's just the way it is, isn't it?" The Baroness replied. "Human society needs a certain degree of security and stability to develop into true civilization. Trying to build anything without strength simply results in it being taken away. In our history, it was those of strength who assumed positions of leadership that others gathered around to lay the foundation of re-ties. They were the original nobles of humanity. Today, we call them martial nobles." Shortly after the Empire's successful rebellion against re-ties, they established the Imperial Army. The martial nobility saw this as the natural evolution of their role, a place where even their spares could create a future for themselves. Frontier nobles and their sergeants over armed retinues became imperial captains and their companies. This conversion, or perhaps adoption, of tradition was the catalyst that led to the officer corps of today's Imperial Army. I do not know whether it was by accident or the product of visionaries in the past, but the Empire took something natural and essential to human society and formalized it, turned it into an institution that serves as the pillar of a nation. As a nation and its army grows, it of course produces commanders and eventually generals, but they serve no purpose without the captains and their companies. As an institution, the Imperial Army has even progressed to the point where they can reliably raise officers without requiring them to be martial nobles first. Ultimately, human militaries revolve around their captains. Humans cannot physically compare to many other races in the world, but captains both reinforce their men on the front lines and stand out as soldiers strong enough to face those threats on behalf of their subordinates, just like their predecessors of old. If a captain is lost in such a situation, you can expect everything to fall apart from there. The Baroness sent a pointed look towards where the fallen sergeant lay under a cloth shroud. As a noble and a student of the Imperial Magic Academy, he was well aware of the Empire's history, but Lady Zaradnik's interpretation of why things were the way they were made assertions that were entirely against the Empire's system of values. It all pointed to her background as a noble of re-ties. The nobles of re-ties, indeed, many nobles of Baharuth still thought the same way, unironically believed in the virtue of their noble blood as if it imparted some mystical properties to their offspring and was the root of anything of any value in society. The Empire's institutions, however, disproved those antiquated beliefs. People could become anything they wanted to with sufficient resources, training and will. If something didn't work out for them, they could always try something else. Deterministic beliefs spoke only of the lazy and useless dregs of society seeking excuses for why things were the way they were. He supposed that the Baroness also attributed her lineage to her enviable position. That's a thought-provoking perspective, my lady. Ray decided there was no merit in arguing her views. Considering what happened here, I'll be sure to make changes too, milady. They turned at the sound of a breathless man from the Baroness' bodyguard. He and several others each bore a cloth bundle in their arms. You must have charged off to check faster than you would have on horseback, Lady Zaradnik smirked. Place stunk like a warehouse full of rotten meat, the man replied, but they were there like you said they'd be. What did you find? Ray eyed the bundles curiously. Varin shifted his burden and raised the cloth laid over it, revealing an ovoid object speckled with black and brown spots. Owlbear eggs, the cavalier grinned. This was just the sort of incentive you were looking for, Lady Zaradnik said, wasn't it, Your Excellency?